A new poll finds Ontario voters equally divided on whether the province is heading in the right direction or is on the wrong track.
More than 6 in 10 respondents to an Abacus data poll say Premier Doug Ford's performance has been excellent, good, or acceptable. 35% rank his performance as poor or terrible. Now, when it comes to who would make the best premier, 35% say Doug Ford, 17% say Andrea Horwath, and 12% went with Stephen Del Duca. Now, if the election was held today, 36% of decided voters would vote PC. 32% would vote Liberal and 23% would vote NDP. The Greens would get about 6% of that vote. And joining us live with more on the poll and some of the top concerns for voters heading into the June 2nd election is David Coletto, the CEO of Abacus Data. David, thanks for joining us this afternoon. What stood out to you the most about this poll? Is it the narrowing gap between the Liberals and Conservatives, or is it Doug Ford's favorability? What's the most significant to you?
I think it's both of those, actually. It's the fact that despite the fact that Mr. Ford's personal numbers, his performance ratings have improved over the last number of months, that the race is tightening between him and the Ontario Liberals. And I think that's an indicator that as we get closer to this campaign and voters start to actually assess their choices, despite the fact that they haven't been overwhelmingly repulsed by what Mr. Ford has done, they aren't necessarily ready to give him, a blank slate in another majority government. So it does suggest this campaign is far from over and certain before it even starts, obviously.
And David, when it comes to vote intention, it looks like 36 Progressive Conservative, 32 Liberal, 23 New Democrat, and 6 Green. What is kind of the magic number these days in Ontario if you want to consider winning a majority? Do you still need to hit that magic 40 number?
I think right now with these numbers, Mr. Ford would probably be hard pressed to win a majority. You do need to hit 40. I think it's a little higher for the Conservatives because they tend to get much larger margins in some of the rural and small town ridings across the province, and the ridings where they did very well in the last election in some parts of Toronto, in the Greater Toronto area, in Ottawa, where I am, were much closer. And so if the Liberals, who in our poll are actually ahead in Metro Toronto, they're competitive in the Greater Toronto area, if they are to hold those numbers, then Doug Ford would need to really win a larger margin province-wide in order to get that majority again. Okay,
now when it comes to what voters are concerned about beyond their ballot preference, David, what I found interesting about your polling was how far down the pandemic was at this point. What was it that voters were really keying in on?
Well, I think voters are generally ready to move past the pandemic. Certainly it's still spreading and we can all hear stories about people who are getting it, but we're looking out to the future. And so an election is typically about what do we want? And there's no doubt that one issue is top of mind to voters of all ages, and that's the cost of living. And so whether you're talking about your gas bills, your food bills, whether it's the price of housing, or the taxes you're paying, all of those are combining to create an environment where I suspect that's going to be a key question that voters are going to be asking. Beyond that, the typical issues, healthcare, long-term care, climate change, they're high up. Interestingly, only 12% of Ontarians said education was a top issue, despite how challenged the education system has been throughout the pandemic. It's not as top of mind right now, but certainly, I got my check in the mail from the provincial government for my plate refund, and that's suggesting that the government and the Progressive Conservatives are well aware that people are feeling a squeeze on their pocketbook, and that shows up clearly in our poll.
Yeah, and I wonder if let's sort of circle and focus directly in on Premier Doug Ford, who wants to be reelected in June. Where have his numbers been over the past couple of years? And the preferability number, because preferred premier, he's sort of way ahead here. A lot of people have criticized the way the government has handled the pandemic, but again, like you mentioned, we're kind of looking to the future. Where has Doug Ford been compared to where he is now?
Well, I think he hasn't been as strong in terms of people's perceptions of him than he has in over a year, certainly. Last April 2020, he made that announcement. It really turned off a lot of people, both in his own base and those that would normally be opposed to him. But in the last few months, we now have more people in Ontario saying they have a positive impression of the Premier than have a negative one. And if you go back all the way before the pandemic, if we can imagine a world like that, we typically saw 60% of Ontarians have a negative view of the Premier. So he's coming into this campaign stronger than, say, Justin Trudeau was federally in terms of his personal brand. And I think that's giving the party lift. There's not as many people out there who are saying, I'm deeply dissatisfied with what the Premier and his government has done. And that's going to make, for the opposition parties, harder to create that desire for change that they need in order to galvanize voters to come out and vote for them.
Okay, certainly really interesting findings with about 6 weeks to go until that spring election. David Coletto, CEO of Abacus Data, really appreciate the time and analysis today. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Take care.